I'm very happy to be here. We'll talk about accessibility today. One of the most important things is that web accessibility has become a real important thing for web developers and content creators um, on the web. So I'm glad you're all here today to learn more about this. Here's what we're going to cover. What is web accessibility? What are what we call the WCAG guidelines? What are the four principles? They're called the POUR principles. Perceivable, can people read the content? Operable, can people use your content? Understandable, can people understand the content? And robust, can machines such as browsers and screen readers read the code? And hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions. So let's talk about what web accessibility is. In a nutshell, what it is it's making your content available to as many people as possible. It's very similar to real life accessibility. You go to a building, there are ramps for folks who have wheelchairs. You're removing barriers that stop users from becoming your customers. So that means people who are visually impaired, hearing impaired, they should be able to access your content the same way someone without disabilities can do so. There are 20% of people have disabilities that use the web, and also we have an aging population. So web accessibility really is the future of web content development. And what is WCAG? WCAG is these are guidelines that have been set up. There are three levels: levels A, AA, and AAA, and they've been around since 1999. Originally, the WCAG 1.0 guidelines had 14 options, ranging from the need to provide alt text for your graphics and also for clarity and simplicity of your content. In 2008, the WCAG Guidelines 2.0 were released, and they came up with these four guiding principles that we're going to talk about more today: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. In 2018, WCAG 2.1, which is the standard now, was built and released. It does not replace 2.0, but 2.0 is grandfathered into it. So if you follow the 2.1 guidelines, you're automatically following the 2.0 as well. And what they are is essentially a framework for creating and remediating websites and apps so they're accessible. It is supported by a lot of documentation. So if you are confused about any of it, there's lots of content out on the web that can explain it to you. And here are the four principles. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, perceivable, can people read your content? Operable, can they use your content? Understandable, can they understand it? And can your content be accessed by browsers and screen readers? So what we're going to do in this presentation is talk a little bit more specifically about what these guiding principles mean. Okay, first, can they read your content? The most important thing is that you provide an alt text, what they call an alternative text to your HTML code that brings and calls an image into a website page. In this example, you see image source, sample photo, and then alt equals you describe your image. And this is very important because people who are visually impaired are not going to see the image, but they still need to understand what the content is. And a good practice for developing alt text is imagine you're describing an image, the image to someone you're talking with on the phone. They can't see it, but then they can get maybe an idea of what the image is all about. That's how a visually impaired person would perceive that. Here's a couple of examples. Here we have a picture of a puppy with a toy, and the alt text could read puppy with toy, but that's not as descriptive as it probably could be. So that's considered a weak alt text description. Something that's stronger is Black Labrador puppy with her Mr. Bill dog toy. Okay, so be as descriptive as you can about your images because it'll help people who are visually impaired or maybe have low vision as well. Now, another thing too is people don't realize is if you're using acronyms within your alt text, there's a certain way you have to code that so the screen readers read it correctly. If we look at our code here, let's say we have MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is known as MIT. Let's say we have their IT department logo displayed on the page, and the alt is set as ITS at MIT. Well, what's happens is the screen reader is going to read it as it's admit, which makes no sense at all. So if you have to use an acronym within your alt text, here's a solution. Put spaces in between the letters of your acronym so it'll read correctly. In this case, I space T space S space at M space I space T would be read as it's ITS at MIT. So that's a way to accommodate acronyms so they're pronounced correctly by the screen readers. And what about complex images, such as bar charts? Now, a visually impaired person can perceive and understand what this chart is about. But there's really a two-part text alternative that's required for something as more complex as this. Number one, you still have to have a short description of an alt text of on the image itself. But then you need a longer description, which is a textual representation of the information that's displayed in the chart. So here you'd have your chart. It would have an alt text associated with the image. But then you'll notice at the bottom left corner of the chart, you have a link for image description. This would link to the longer description. So here's the code. You have your image source, the alt text bar chart showing monthly and total visitors for the first quarter 2014 to sites 1 through 3. And then the link to an HTML page, which has the longer description. Now, a good way to solve this problem with the longer description is to provide the longer description as a table, as an accessible table. So in this case, the screen reader would come in and say, for the period of January, site 1 had 135 visitors, site 2 had 112 visitors, site 3 had 92 visitors. So that would be a way to accommodate the screen readers so that people who are visually impaired are hearing the content, and that whole process of the two steps would then make your bar chart accessible. Another thing is, what about a flow chart? We see these all the time. Organization charts, flow charts. You still have to have that short description in the image itself. But in this case, what we do is we'd use what we call a nested list, an HTML nested list to convey the image. And here's what it would look like. As you notice, standards is the first block in the flow chart. It would read standards forward to theme, back to standards, 2.2 will go forward, etc. So this would be a way of describing your flow chart in an accessible way. Now, time-based media is important too. So many people depend on video, audio and video on the web. Your audio-only content should also be conveyed in text. You should attach a text description to that, similar to the link we saw at the bottom of that bar chart. You'd have a link to an HTML page that maybe had the audio content in text. And also, any video content with no audio should be described in text as well, but it can also be described with audio. So the best practice is always include a text transcript with your audio and video files. Now, all videos have to be captioned. All pre-recorded videos must be captioned. And that's a big way of people being sued on their websites if they're providing video without captioning. And a tool that I use all the time, and it's based in Britain, it's called Trint, and it enables me to upload a video. And in the video, it'll be transcribed. Let me show you the process here. Now, because we're using Zoom here, sometimes the audio in showing these tools is a little low. So hopefully you can hear this. But I've uploaded a video here. And you'll notice the video, once it's uploaded, it's transcribed the audio for me. So I can make corrections or whatever. And it can...
Here, the dog returns to the hammock. Introduction. Encourage the puppy over to you with a treat or toy as
Now, you'll see that as the video is read, the text becomes bold as it reads across. I can stop it at any time, make corrections, whatever. Then I need to export it, and I can export it so that the captioning is created in a SRT file, they call it. That's called a subrip file. You can then embed that in YouTube or whatever you use for your videos, and the captioning will be correct, and and then your video will be accessible. Also, you're able to download a text version of this text file as well in order to include that on your web page near the video, so people who only want a text version of the content would have access to that. Trint's a great tool. You can sign on for it. It's trint.com. Sign on for it and get a free trial. It's wonderful. I use it all the time. Now, embedding videos, most of the time you're going to use something called an iframe. For your developers out there, you know what an iframe is. It holds the video, etc. But you need to include something called a title attribute with the video itself. Let me show you the code for that. You'll see here in this, in the cranberry colored code title, let's say we had a video of Apollo 13 views of the moon. You would have to, in the iframe, include an attribute, a tiled attribute that would describe that. So just make a note that if you're going to be embedding videos, say from YouTube, on your website page, you also need to include a title of that describes that video in your iframe code. Another thing is adaptable. Info and relationships. You should have a logical structure to all of the pages on your website. The content and structure and relationships are programmatically determined. And here's some best practices to do that. You're always going to use HTML5 if you can. Okay, that's the standard right now for HTML pages. Break up your content with subheadings. Mark your headings with HTML header tags. Use list tables and other formats where needed. Use valid HTML5 everywhere. And also important, you need to use clear labels on forms. Here's some examples. The label element itself needs to have some association to the form element, meaning let's say we had a form element where I could type my first name. You'll notice label for first name matches the ID first name and the actual input type for the label itself. So those have to match. The for attribute in the label and the ID attribute value in the text field code has to match. If you're using a checkbox, you have the ID in the checkbox code, ID subscribe, and then you add the label for next to the content that the instruction that the user would see next to that checkbox. Now, another option, let's say you're designing forms and you don't want to have a search label. Maybe you have no room for that in your design, a visual label for the search form. You still have to have it, but what can you do to get around that problem? You can use something called an area label. An area label is recognized by the screen readers as something that it needs to announce. So in this case, let's say we just had a search button with just the blank field and the search button itself. You could say in the search input, search, the role is search, the area label, search the site here. So someone comes along, uses a screen reader, hits this, it would read, you would hear the area label read, search the site here. So the visually impaired person knows they're right in the code, in that space where they can go ahead and type in their keyword phrase. Another thing is you have to have a meaningful sequence on your pages, meaning the visual presentation of the content has to match what the screen reader is reading out in the appropriate order. So you need to present your content in a meaningful order, separate navigation menus from the content, use paragraphs in order, nest your headings from H1 down to show their importance, choose whether a list needs numbering or not, and use valid HTML as I've mentioned before. Now here's some example code. You might want to make a note here. On each web page, you can only use the H1 heading one time in order to make things accessible. The reason for that is the first thing a screen reader user is going to look for is the H1 tag, because the content that's held within the H1 element, that explains what the content of the page is all about. You can then use your H2 tags as subheaders, then H3s as maybe sub-subheaders. But the main thing is you don't want to skip headings, meaning if I came into this page, I have an H1 tag, then I had an H2, then I wanted to use an H4, that would fail. The screen reader would stop and say, wait a minute, I'm looking for an H3. So you need to make sure it's in the appropriate order. Also, another thing is you can't refer to things by color, size, position, or shape. And here's why. Sensory characteristics are commonly used in instructions for users, but some people maybe have cognitive disorders, or sometimes you say use the search bar on the right. They might not understand what right means, meaning direction right, or click the blue button. Maybe some users can't see the color blue. So you have to take that into consideration when when creating instructions for your users. And a good example of this is for the dyslexic reader. People who are dyslexic, beware of using italicized characters. They find it very difficult to read the slanted character. They have a hard time comprehending each character letter. Also, your column lists, use the column lists that are narrow, maybe 60 to 80 characters. A lot of times, just people who are dyslexic have a very hard time keeping track of content that goes beyond that. And also, don't use justified text. As you can see in the screenshot here with the little yellow areas, those refer to what we call rivers of white space. These rivers make it difficult for the dyslexic reader to understand the content. It actually stops them. So a good rule of thumb is always use always align your text to the left on your pages. Now, the use of color is important too. Color should never be used to convey meaning or to convey instructions. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's say you have a reader who's colorblind, and people who are colorblind, there's lots of different types of color blindness, but a common one is red. So if you said press the red button, if you see the objects here, press the red button, this is how one type of color blindness would convey a red button. There's no red there. It almost looks like a black. Okay, so that's one form of color blindness. Then you could say, read the green button. But then some people couldn't understand green. They would see that as more of an aqua. So the main point here is don't use color to convey any kind of instruction or meaning. Now, another thing too is sometimes colorblind folks have a hard time understanding what you want them to do. So a good way to get around this, a good best practice would be, in this case, to use icons. Let's take a look at a sample of a checkout for buying sneakers. Here's a checkout box. On the left-hand column, we see it's not accessible to colorblind users because they can't really make out what the checkout button means. However, a way to get around that, if you look on the right column, an accessible way is to put a little icon of the shopping cart in there. That gives the colorblind user an idea that this is a checkout and this is something that I can use. Another thing we have to watch is the contrast between text and background colors. This is a big part of accessibility. The text against the background color has to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. And a good way to get around that is to check it. And to check it, we use something called accessiblecolors.com. Here, let's say we have a background color of white, or let's say we make it black. And the text color, let's say we make that red. And you see here that it's failing. The contrast, the red against the black can't be seen. You could change the background color so the red against the lighter gray is seen. It passes with a 4.5 ratio. And the text color could be changed to a brighter red so it could be seen against that black background. Here's another example. Here we have a band of yellow, and in the band of yellow we have a blue link that is against that mustard color. It's going to fail against the mustard color because it has a contrast ratio of 3.47. You could either, as a suggestion, change the contrast color to a lighter yellow or change the text color to a darker blue. Also, color contrast is important for your icons as well. You'll see here we have 3 icons. The first is a light green that will fail actually against a white background with a 2.29 contrast ratio. The icon in the middle, the darker green, looks like it would pass, but actually it does fail. It only has a contrast ratio of 3.86. And the icon on the right, an even darker green, has a passing contrast ratio of 5.27. Another thing too is people love to do is they love to put text in as images. And my advice to you on that is don't do that. Just use text and use your style sheets to design and color your text. Don't use images of text. It just makes work for you. If you use an image of text, then you have to add an alt text. Also, your website has to be fully responsive, meaning your text should be able to be resized. The content should look good if it does, depending if it's on a mobile phone, on a tablet, or on a laptop or a larger desktop system. The content needs to adjust and be readable and usable. Also, the zoom needs to be set to 200% of the browser settings so that people can zoom up and down to see if they're having a hard time reading the content. Best practices for text. Your line height, your line spacing should be at least 1.5 times the font size. That's also known as leading in the old printing industry, baseline to baseline. You should have at least 1.5 times the font size of white space between lines. The spacing following paragraphs should be 2 times the font size. Letter spacing should be at least 0.12 times the font size, and word spacing at least 0.16 times the font size. Now, another issue too is you have keyboard focus and let's say you want content to reappear. The content must be dismissible by the user without having to move any kind of keyboard focus or hover. It has to be persistent until the user decides to change the keyboard focus at all. There's also a design flaw for the most responsive websites in that it affects users who experience hand tremors. And a big problem is that maybe users don't have enough space between the touch targets on mobile devices because they have hand tremors. Let me show you an example of that. Let's say here's an example, a mobile layout. Someone who has hand tremors needs to be able to place one finger to steady their hand on the mobile area so they can select an item. Here's a solution. Make sure there's always 60 pixels of vertical space between content objects, so it's easier for the user with hand tremors to anchor a finger so that they control the mobile screen. Okay. Can people use the content? Okay, can you get around using the keyboard alone? Best practices. Make sure all elements on the page, buttons, links, forms, etc. are reachable by the tab key. And make sure the users are able to activate buttons, links, and form controls using the Enter or Spacebar keys. And here's what I mean by that. And you also have to ensure that people have no keyboard trap. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a website called Manulife. And by using the tab key, I can tab through and select items on the page. Now, in this case, they have a hamburger menu where I can go ahead and click Enter, and the menu pops up. But I still should be able to tab through content in order to select something. Now, here's another thing too. By hitting the Shift tab key, I should be able to move backwards and then close that window with an Enter key in order to progress and close that window so I can go back to the parent page. That's what I mean by not having getting people caught in the by using the tab key. No keyboard trap. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. This is interfering. I beg your pardon. Let's go back here. Okay, another thing too, if you're using animated GIFs, you need to make sure that there is a flashing. Flashes don't last longer than 5 seconds because that can cause seizures with people who are epileptic. And there's a great tool by the University of Maryland called Trace. And what you can do is you can download the tool and then run your animation, your animated GIFs through that to make sure that that will pass. It's a wonderful free tool. So if you're using a lot of animated GIFs, you want to test them first before you put them online to make sure they pass for accessibility. Also, you need to bypass blocks. Another way is you need to add skip to content links for keyboard users who want to jump past navigation. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. Here's a website for a dentist in Albany, New York. And if I tab through here, I hit my tab key once and it says skip to main content. If I didn't do that, I would have to tab all the way through all those, the home, about us, services, all those navigation blocks in the navigation bar. But by hitting enter, I can move down past that and go to the main content area. That's known as a skip to content link. And that's important that you add that to all your web pages. Also, if you're doing forms, your forms have to be navigable in the correct focus order, the correct order. Here's an example. If you have an accessible form on the left, you'll see that the street address is available first through the keyboard, through the tab key, then second the city, state, zip. That makes sense. But what's not accessible, if I'm tabbing through, if you see on the right there, I'm tabbing through and I see the one appears first, the street address, then it goes to zip code, then city, then state. That doesn't make any sense to the user. So you want to make sure that everything is in the correct order. Another thing too is you need to check your tab order. There is a Chrome extension called tabbing order. And to do that, we use something called Tab Ally. And I'm just going to demo this. This is available for Chrome. And I'm going to run it. And you see it checks the website. And you'll see this shows the actual tab order that people who are using a tab key will use through the website. It's a wonderful tool. It's an extension you can add to Chrome, and a link to that will be in that resource document that that you'll receive after the seminar. Now, link purpose is also important. It's clear that where a link is, a link itself, people have to click on the link and then know where they're going once they click on that link. Here's an example. Let's say you go out to a news site and you have a lot of these read more links. Well, people who are using a screen reader are going to say, what am I reading? Am I reading the local news about a tax hike? Or am I reading a local news about how to get hired for the summer in the city of Marlborough? So which article is it that you want to read? So you have to help the screen reader user out a bit. And you do that by adding an area label again to your link code. In this case, the visual user would see read more, not a problem. They know they're clicking on that particular piece of news. But the screen reader user would hear read more about the Marlborough tax hike when they hit that link. Then all they do is have to hit enter in order to go there. So get in the habit of using area labels in your text links in order to accommodate the screen readers if you just don't have room for that read more, to make that read more instruction any bigger. And here's another option. Here's that back to our option that we saw during our color ratio example. Click here for the DPS website. Do yourself a favor, just make those words click here for the DPS website all linked, and there's your instruction. And then you can change the color on that, and there's no need to use an area label. Also, header navigation is not the only way to get around a website. There's another way, such as on-page links, a sitemap, and a site-wide search. Here's a visible, and make sure you also have your focus
Hi, Mary.
visible.
Sorry, we're just not seeing your screen.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Bear with me. Wonder what happened there.
Hi, Mary. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was me or I
I'm
think in
sorry.
sort of the going back and forth, I think we temporarily have lost the PowerPoint. So we'll get back on track, everyone, in just a minute while Mary just finds the share the screen and share the PowerPoint once again.
I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. Uh, how's that?
Yeah, that's great. If you want to just bring it up full screen, hit the little projector at the bottom.
Yep.
Perfect. We are
Okay.
good to go. We're back in action.
Where did we lose? Did I lose you guys? Is this? Let's continue here. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
I think we
sorry
can
about that.
continue. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. In order for your link purpose to be seen, what you can do here too, instead of adding an area label, just make that whole link, as you see, instead of the word here, then make that whole link. Um, Click here for DPS website activated, and therefore you don't have to use an area label. Also, there's multiple ways of getting around a website. Make sure that you have sitemap or site-wide search. There's multiple ways that people can find your content. Also, make sure that your focus is visible on your website. As an example, let's say I go out here to another site called Vital Pro Naturals. And if you watch my screen here as I'm tabbing, there's my skip to content. Notice there's that dotted outline around the content. I can see where I am as I tab through. That's what's mean by focus, that the focus is available to the user as they go along. Now, can people understand the content? Here's an important point, especially if you're developing websites with two different languages. That you need to assign the primary language to the web page. You have, in this case, English Canada or language French Canada. You would add that to your HTML tag at the top of your page, of your HTML page. But what if you're using more than one language on the page? One of the best practices is you can use several languages, but the default text processing language is the language that's used the most. If several languages are used, the first language used should be used as a default human language. Also, maybe you have on the language of the page, maybe you have more than one language of the page, and what do you do for your alt text? For your alt text, the alt text should be used, the alt text that should be in the primary language of the page. If the main language is French, then your alt text for images needs to be in French as well. Your language of parts, let's say you have a website and there's just a certain section of your page that changes language. Then you can add a lang attribute within one of your HTML tags, like a paragraph tag, to say, I'm changing this to US Spanish, I'm changing the language to German. So that would be a way around that to alert the screen readers that there's a change in language. On focus, just make sure if people are focusing on an element on your page that there's no unexpected changes for them. And this gets down to something that is used often on the website is when these pop-ups pop up, like maybe your web page loads and a pop-up. That can really cause people to be confused about what's happening. The rule of thumb here is that you should give the user the autonomy to open that pop-up, and marketers hate that. They don't want to hear that at all, but that can be very discouraging for some users, and they may leave your site if they're startled by a pop-up window that automatically opens. Also, consistent navigation. Your navigation should be consistent page to page, meaning you're going to find the nav menu in the same area, all the standard elements like the logo, search functionality, etc., skip links in the same location on the page. Also, consistent identification. Let's say you're using social media and you have your icons for Twitter, how to print a page, Facebook. They should all be in the same location, and they use consistent icons to in the presentation. Okay, now what about screen readers and browsers? Can they read the code? Here's a couple of evaluation tools that you can use. Here's one of them. Let me just demo one. This is WebAIM. And what you do is you simply put the address in their tool. You hit submit, and this nice little testing tool appears on the left. It tells me I have no accessibility errors, no contrast errors. There may be an alert or two, whatever. This is a free tool to use. There's also versions for Firefox, Edge, and also Chrome that you can download and put in your browser. Lighthouse is another tool like this. It comes from Google. AxDev Tools is a wonderful tool to use. It's a paid tool. It's about $40 a month. It's something I use often. It allows you to access sites, scan them, and it provides these wonderful spreadsheets sheets of errors that you can then use for your accessibility remediation work. And Arc Toolkit is another option to use, a paid tool as well. Screen readers that are universally used are NVDA, which is out of Australia. It's a free screen reader. Unfortunately, it's only available for PCs running Microsoft Windows 7 and above user operating system. JAWS is a standard. You can download JAWS. It is a paid product, but it is a standard in the industry. And if you're testing on any kind of Mac device, iOS device, VoiceOver is built in, and any Android device as tablets or mobile phones, TalkBack is the accessibility reader that's built into that. Now these are the standard reader browser testing combos: Windows and Chrome and JAWS, Windows, Firefox browser, NVDA, Mac and Chrome for VoiceOver, iPad and iPhone for VoiceOver, and Android, tablet, and phone. You would use the TalkBack to test. I'd like to demo what a screen reader sounds like. Now, again, we're using the Zoom reader here, and sometimes the Zoom software interferes with how loud this is. But let me demo this for you. Hopefully you can hear it.
Okay. Web aim. Web accessibility in mind and 10 more pages work Microsoft Edge window. Web aim. Web accessibility in mind. Banner landmark link skip to main content. Heading level 2 visited link graphic web aim web accessibility in mind. Navigation landmark heading level 2 main navigation. List with 5 items link. Note and note not over and x OK.
So now you see, as you hear that, why it's important that your content be in the correct order, because a screen reader such as NVDA is going to go down through the code, and if it's not coded correctly, the content will get all messed up. There's also other resource links. There's a great link for Canadian accessibility called Towards an Accessible Canada. Also, there's guidance for the web accessibility in the ADA. That's here in the United States. Americans with Disabilities Act, if you'd like to find out more about that, there's a link to that. They'll be in your resource document you receive. Also, the WCAG 2 overview, and also there's something called the 508 standards, which is the American government, the accessibility standards and guidelines that we use here for testing government sites. But people ask me all the time, what should we really be following? If you follow WCAG 2.1 guidelines for levels A and AA when you do your testing, you'll be in good shape. And there's additional potpourri here, additional resources. One thing you really need to do is to get an accessibility statement on your website. And there's a nice tool that can help you do that. It's the W3C has a web accessibility initiative, and it helps you generate a statement. You would put in the name of your organization, your website, the name of your website or application, the level you want to go to, and tell if how it conforms, etc. It's a wonderful tool to use for creating an accessibility statement. Also, there's other accessibility testing resources you'll find on that handout as you go along. There we go. And another thing too, important, if you're creating files for the web and you want them to be accessible, doesn't matter if it's HTML, PDFs, whatever, Excel spreadsheets, make sure there are no spaces or special characters in your file name. I know with Word documents, we're used to just typing as we would and leaving spaces. That will cause problems with the screen readers. The screen readers will not be able to access them. So a good rule of thumb is to use spaces or underscores for your file names. Another thing too is you can, let's say you're creating content for folks in the Middle East and they read right to left rather than left to right. What you can do is you can change the direction, just use your direction right to left RTL attribute and put in the language of how it's supposed to be read, and that will cause the browser to read from right to left. So that's a bit about accessibility. I'm going to pass it back here.
All right. This has been awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take some questions. And as everybody is thinking of questions, I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about where we can proceed with this. So one is if you want to take more courses in accessibility or courses even with our instructor here, Mary, on the web accessibility, you would go to greatcanadiantraining.ca. As you can see here, you would go to courses, accessibility training. You would hit that, it would come up. And then you go down here to compare our access courses. Sorry, wrong courses. The accessibility training. Let's go back to that. There we go, accessibility, and then compare, and then we want. Oh, this is going faster than I can handle here. So courses, accessibility training. Here we go. We'll just show you the different courses that are available as you're thinking of your questions, and make sure to put them in the chat. Go to accessibility. We compare our accessibility courses. And then here is our book accessibility training. Let's go right here down to the bottom. So we got our two-day courses that are being done by Mary. One is our creating an accessible website for developers and designers. So that is a 2-day course, and you can see they're happening in September and November. Then our other course, if you're interested, is creating an accessible website for digital content creators and managers. And that is happening just in a few weeks in August and then again on October. We've also got our creating accessible documents in Microsoft Office. And then our upcoming new course is creating accessible PDFs using Adobe Acrobat Pro. And you can see the dates here, and you can find that in accessibility. Also on our website, while you're there, we've also got our free resources page where you've got everything from our podcasts, our downloads. There's accessibility ribbons as an example that you can use, best shortcuts. We've got previous webinars, and you can also look at future webinars as well as our blog. Let's go back now to Mary, and we'll answer any questions that we may have. And just give you a few minutes to put in your questions. And Mary, I do have a couple of questions here. It looks like we got some questions in the chat. All right. So question one, so Mel has got some of them that have come in. Question one, is WCAG 2.1 backward compatible with WCAG 2.0?
Yes. Yes, it is. If you follow the WCAG 2.1 guidelines, the WCAG 2.0 guidelines are automatically grandfathered in, so you're covered.
Okay, great. Mel's got another question here. Can you test for keyboard accessibility if you're using a Mac?
You can.
Mm-hmm.
However, the issue is that the Mac isn't automatically set up for keyboard testing. So that resource document that you're going to receive will have a link to instructions on how to activate your Mac so that you can use the keyboard for testing.
Mm-hmm. Then, all right, we have another question here. So, Mary, what are the most common accessibility errors website owners can get sued over for non-compliance? That's a really good question.
Yes, big ones. All text is missing. Your navigation bar at the top of your page, it can't be accessible, especially if you have submenus, by using the keyboard. And what I mean by that, you have to use the tab key and your down arrow keys to move up and down through the submenus. Many websites are not set up to do that. That takes some special coding with area labels and JavaScript in order to make that happen. PDFs are a big problem. If you're using a lot of PDFs on your website, they need to be accessible. And a lot of people are being sued because they're not, what they do is they scan a PDF or they just save a PDF out of Word, throw it up on the website and think everything's done. You know, that happens a lot with press releases and news, et cetera, the things that are going to change quickly. But the issue is that screen readers, unless the PDF is remediated and tagged so that the screen reader can read down through the content, it is not considered accessible, and many people are being sued for that right now. As an example, here in the United States, a lot of small restaurants use PDFs for their menus, and they just throw them up on the web, and they're not accessible. And here, the mom and pop shops are being sued $5,000-$7,000 because they're getting a demand letter that their website is not accessible for their users. So you need to be careful of that. The keyboard accessibility is very important, and also the color contrast too, because there's a lot of people who have low vision. And
Mhm.
you know, as we get older, sign me up. As we get older, you cannot. Sometimes the text can't be, if the text can't be enlarged or the color contrast is not enough, then people cannot read it, and that's you're losing customers. As a matter of fact, if you cannot make these items accessible. So those are the main ones, really, that I would say.
Yeah, really good example. Things that we overlook and take for granted. So,
Absolutely.
really good examples. As we're still thinking of some questions, and then Mary, sorry, I'll just ask you maybe a final thought or maybe a final question that you always get. I just want to let everyone know that if you enjoyed this webinar, you can also go to our free resources at greatcanadiantraining.ca to look at previous webinars, including our webinar on accessibility in Microsoft, but also upcoming webinars. We've got emotional intelligence in August, making your charts a work of art in September. In October, we go back to our soft skills of giving feedback like a leader, not a critic. And then November, it's back to our software skills on Power Up with Power Query. So those are our upcoming webinars. So Mary, maybe a final thought or maybe a final question, maybe that's quite common that you get.
A common question I get all the time is, well, I'm not going to bother with accessibility. I'm a small site. I'm a small business. Why bother? Well, here's what's happening here in the United States. The Department of Justice about 2 months ago came across and said, we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act. They include now web accessibility as part of the American Disabilities Act, meaning if you have a public facing website, just like you would have a business open to the general public, if you have a public facing website, it needs to be accessible. And people are going to court more and more now because they're thinking that it's not them. But really, you could be losing customers because the people just can't get to your content. And people with disabilities have money to spend too. So you want to make it as fair as you can for everybody to access your content. So just be careful. You're better off spending money now to make it accessible than being sued. So final thought.
Yeah, no, great. Really, really helpful. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for the webinar. And Mary, I want to give you a big round of applause. A lot of great information here, very clear, really helpful and as you said, making this accessible to all and really thinking about all the possibilities that we can use, all the information that you gave us and all the tools that you gave us. Some really, really good information. I look forward to taking your courses coming up, your 2-day course coming up in August. That'll be really interesting to get even more details about this. So without any further ado, if there's no further questions, thank you all for joining us on this webinar. And again, this webinar will be available on YouTube. And for those of you that signed up, you will be receiving the handout, which will get a lot of the information that Mary had shared with us. So thank you all. And again, thank you, Mary, for presenting such great information.
Thank you all very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
And we have a comment here from Claire just saying, thank you for the informative presentation, Mary.
Oh, great. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire, for joining us. Thank you for that comment. All right, then, Melanie, I think we will bring this webinar then to a close.
Absolutely.